This is a special podcast produced for download for Mining News and Mining Monthly. In this episode, we look at one key area of Australia's mining sector: rehabilitation and tailings storage facilities. There's a colloquial saying that if it's not grown, it's mined. But along with this, mine closure and rehabilitation, as well as mining tailing management, is becoming ever more important. Mining companies throughout Australia are acutely aware of the risks and challenges associated with tailing storage facilities. Tailings storage facilities are designed and engineered structures to permanently store tailings from mine sites. A new partnership announced this year between ASX-listed K2Fly and leading agriculture and mining rehabilitation tech business Decipher is offering Australian miners a new solution that tackles one of the mining industry's biggest challenges. I'm joined today by the Chief Executive of Decipher, Anthony Walker, and Chief Commercial Officer of ASX-listed K2Fly, Nick Pollock. Good morning. Welcome to you both.
Good morning.
Let's start at the beginning, where all good stories start. Perhaps for our listeners unfamiliar with both of the companies, you could start by giving us a bit of an overview. Anthony?
Thank you. My name's Anthony Walker. I'm CEO of Decipher. We started off as a corporate startup in the Wesfarmers business. We focus primarily on agricultural solutions, leveraging our existing business units inside WesCEF. And really it was looking at satellite remote sensing, looking at samples, laboratory samples and variable rate application of fertilisers for our farming customers in Western Australia. As a corporate startup, we wanted to take the platform and solution global, so developed a software as a service platform and started taking that to market. I joined the business about a little over 2 years ago, and immediately saw that there was an adjacency in the mining sector that we could apply that sort of look and that sort of view to. So we started diving into the rehabilitation reclamation space in terms of mining and applying the remotely sensed technology into that and made some good gains and footholds in there. About a year ago, RCMM and other investor organisations started looking at all these tailing storage facilities issues that were coming out in the media and all the initiatives that were getting started at around that time. And certainly me and my team thought that we could extend Decipher a little bit more around that tailings monitoring space. We took some time to revisit it and relook at it, and have spent a lot of time getting to grips with governance and monitoring in that space. Yeah.
Nick, what about K2Fly?
Yeah, so I'm Chief Commercial Officer of K2Fly. As you said before, it's an ASX-listed software business. So we're focused predominantly on the resources sector globally.
Yeah.
And we provide software as a service to that. In the enterprise space, so across those enterprises, we tend to deal with the corporate offices of those organisations because we're dealing with technical assurance, predominantly in mineral inventories and mineral resource governance. But we're extending that and have been extending that across environmental, social and governance risks as well for a number of years now.
Decipher was first established quite a long time ago. What's your background in agriculture and mining?
Well, agriculture, probably not as flashy as the mining side. I come from a farming family and farming parents, so that's kind of where the interest got piqued for me. But I've been working in mining and in the mining space for the last 30 years, from South Africa across to Australia. And always in the technology space, in software and environmental monitoring side of things. So that's kind of naturally where I fit, leading and running software companies that focus on that.
My guests today are Anthony Walker, Chief Executive of Decipher, and Nick Pollock, the Chief Commercial Officer for K2Fly. Nick, we've heard Anthony's background. What's yours?
Okay. Well, I've worked in technology my whole career. I think I'm now over that terrible 25-year mark, which makes me a veteran. And predominantly enterprise technology with the likes of Oracle and NatWest Bank and things like that. Since moving back to Perth in about 2014, I've sort of pretty much been in resources, so mining software for the last 15 plus years, and that's become sort of my thing and my passion.
Yeah.
And I've worked for some of the biggest mining software companies globally, which sort of gives me a kind of a unique perspective on that. What I love about the K2 Fly position and working with K2 Fly is that it gives me a chance to actually obviously work in technology in mining, but also pursue one of my other passions, which is in ESG and sustainability. So to that effect, K2 Fly has been really supportive of me to pursue that and supported me through a postgrad at Cambridge in sustainability leadership, and that's obviously very related to what we do. So the papers I wrote were about mining finance and how that becomes more repeatable through an ESG lens, and then on tailings as well was the second paper I did. So that's, you can see it directly applying to our business. So I'm really pleased to be able to do that.
Why is now such an ample time, Anthony, to be discussing tailing storage facilities?
Well, in the past, I think it's been really difficult for interested and affected stakeholders to access information around TSFs. Certainly, this has been evidenced a little bit by investors, medias, researchers, shareholders, regulators, etc., who in the past have been looking for information. There's been a far higher level of demand. If you look at the PRI, UNEP, and ICMM disclosure process, the demand for more information about these sites by these stakeholders has been pretty critical. So obviously organisations that are looking to get this information out responsibly need a platform to do it, and that's kind of what we're focusing on.
We've now had a global tailings standard review following the Brumadinho disaster of last year. That was a failure of a storage facility in 2019 at a tailings dam in Brazil. What impact has this had on mining operations here in Australia?
So the impact that disasters around the world have had on mining operations in other areas has been pretty significant. Deloitte put out an ESG and mining 2020 review as part of its Deloitte Insights program, and was looking at trend one around the social investor. They were saying that miners have to work really hard to help regain investor trust, and miners should embrace a commitment to value beyond just compliance. And that's certainly something that's been lifted out by that and other recent disasters.
Nick, what are your thoughts on TSFs following the 2019 disaster?
Yeah, well, I think it was the beginning of a trend that we're going to see more of in terms of the way the community, the stakeholders, and particularly finance have responded to a disaster such as this in mining. We've seen a more recent example of something similar in terms of the cave disaster that happened in the Pilbara with the Juukan Caves. And what it says, the way K2 Fly looks at this is that essentially mining companies historically have operated in a federated model very, very successfully because of distance and remoteness and all those sorts of things. So people needed to make decisions on site in a timely manner in order to progress, essentially, right? Now, with what we call sort of radical transparency in terms of everything you do is watched, photographed, spread on social media very, very quickly, and stakeholders can get a hold of that really quickly. That model is not necessarily as effective as it used to be in terms of the consequences of making bad decisions on site, as we're seeing. So what we're seeing is that the effect that Brumadinho had, and a number, well, not just Brumadinho, Samarco, Brumadinho, other tailings disasters, and now we're seeing things in cultural heritage, is that companies need to manage their risk at a corporate level. And whilst that federated model is successful, has been successful, and will continue to be in certain areas, you need to manage that risk at a corporate level. So, as we saw recently, a decision made in the Pilbara had massive impact on the company's reputation and also senior executives.
The two of you, Decipher, K2 Fly, have now joined forces in a new collaboration that was announced in June, July this year. How did this collaboration come about, Nick?
Obviously, the way we break it up is that K2 Fly comes at this from a corporate governance perspective, and that's our sweet spot. And we do that, as we've said, at a corporate level across all sites across any organisation in terms of we roll up the data from the sites and report it in the annual report in terms of the mineral inventory. A number of our clients said to us, you know what, you should be using this technology or this capability in order to report tailings as well, because it's a very similar process in terms of rolling up data from the facility up through the organisation and then ultimately disclosing it to the market. So we set about doing that. And we do that also in partnership with SAP, which is a very important partnership for us. So we operate at that level. What we don't do is get down into the monitoring side of things. And that's where we had known Anthony in particular and Decipher from around the traps, being in Perth. And we knew that that's
something.
That's right. A small place. And we knew that that's something that they were excelled in. And also the rehab stuff was really interesting to us and our corporate goals. So we started the conversation, and we immediately, not long into the conversation, realised that we both did different things that added up to an overall solution for the customer. So it was very much a sort of 1 + 1 equaling much, much more than 2. And there was sort of a clear touch point and handshake where what Decipher did and what KT Fly did. So it was actually really easy in many ways. Yeah,
and we kind of saw that a lot of customers were asking us to look at a disclosure solution, so managing data, not necessarily just monitoring data around an operation, but also what sort of data gets disclosed to market. And that process for us was relatively easy, but the more difficult part and the more beefy part to manage is what Nick's just pointed out, all the governance that sits behind that. So it was a natural fit for us to kind of start working together.
Well, let's take a closer look at the work that you're doing, the platform that you're using. It's an integrated governance and monitoring platform for TSFs. Can you break down how this platform works for us?
So technically, it's a cloud-based platform, and the idea is because it's cloud-based, it can be accessed not only internally by the organisation, but externally as well. Those could be consultants, they could be investors, they could be stakeholders outside of the business, they could be regulators, and that access to information, obviously curated access to information, is pretty important. So the cloud-first kind of approach lends itself to a natural solution. We also went down the route of making sure that it's a single tenant approach. So we're very careful about security of information, and that single tenancy is important to our customers. They can manage it; it's their data, and they decide how much or how little gets disclosed or accessed by third parties. We also love to approach it map-centric. My background is GIS and spatial. And certainly with KT Fly, the Esri partnership is a really important one as well. People understand maps. It tells a thousand, picture paints 1,000 words. And just condensing all of this data, which is quite diverse and quite vast, onto a map-centric kind of view, just makes it a little bit easier to manage and go through. So the platform leverages Google Earth Engine and Microsoft Azure, the two kind of key foundational groups for us to deliver the solution out to the customer base.
So, I mean, who's using this platform at the moment? I mean, is it small caps or large caps? I noted, Nick, you mentioned Rio Tinto. Sorry, Anthony, you mentioned Rio Tinto earlier. Definitely. If you look at the number of storage facilities around the world and which facilities report to which, the ICMM members, obviously they have about 30% of all TSFs globally. 70% of non-members, kind of make up the next 5,000. I think the other thing to think about is all of the abandoned TSFs and the rehabilitation side. Nick, you touched on reclamation and rehabilitation. Now, that's also an important part of the conversation, is not only talk about here and now, but it's talk about what's a strategy in 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So that's pretty important to us. We focus as a business, we focused on tier 1 and tier 2 type miners. So that's kind of the sweet spot that we're after. Multi sites. Generally, there is a efficiency that can be overcome for sites that are operating in lots of locations globally, bringing that back corporately, massaging and working with that data, and then disclosing it, and that kind of reports to tier 1s and tier 2s. So those are our main customer base at the moment. Nick, Anthony touched on a really important point, which I think is often missed in this conversation, which is planning during the lifetime of a mine, and even mine design as well. Can you tell me a little bit about how K2Fly and Decipher are working in that space?
A lot of these mines, when they're in design phases and going for finance, generally they're all based on a 5-year mine life. Right? So what happens is that you build your structures and your infrastructure in and around a 5-year mine life. Now, I think there's only been one mine in Australia, for instance, that's ever shut down.
Yeah.
Right? So a lot of these mines get older and older and older and older.
Yeah.
So what you do is you build a tailings dam that's designed for 5 years.
Yeah.
And 5 years only. And then you say, okay, we're going to extend the mine life for another 5 or 10 or 20. And what they do is they pile on pile for the dam wall, which is not structurally sound because it's not designed for a 30-year. It's designed for 5. That's not just a problem with Australia. That's a global issue, and which is why a lot of these tailings dams are very, very old and somewhat under-spec'd for what
They should be
they
doing.
didn't anticipate the mine life being that long.
And generally, what happens when you're operating the mine, the actual waste product stream that comes out of it changes over time. So you could design it for A, but 5 years' time they change the plant around and it become B and C, depending on where they're getting ore out the ground.
Nick, let's talk about K2Fly and your involvement with Decipher and how exactly you fit in to this platform and the product that they're providing.
Yeah, so we came at this very early from the view of supporting the Global Tailings Standard, which was a result of the ICMM and the Church of England initiatives and what have you. So we see our role in life is to provide technology and solutions that support global standards, essentially.
Yeah.
So that's really what we do very well in the mineral inventory space. We support the JORC code in Australia, we support NI 4311 in Canada and so forth. So those standards are determined by industry standards. So that's the way we wanted to approach this as well. We knew that the Global Tailings Standard was coming. Now, a really important part of what came out of that review and that initiative is that a failing of a dam is as much a failing of governance in that organisation as it is the dam wall itself.
Yeah.
Okay. So you've got to, if you really want to be dinkum about this, you have to address both of those issues.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting. I'm sure Anthony will back me up. Is that shortly after those disasters and after questions were being asked, like the Church of England, lots of companies raced into monitoring because they wanted to monitor their dams as much as possible to protect themselves from that kind of risk. That's all good and important and necessary, which is part of the reason why we joined up with Decipher. But what you then need to do is a more fundamental review of your governance processes. And the Global Tailings Standard, or the GTS, does that in detail. So it maps out a structure within the organisation in order, naming things like responsible executives on the exec who's responsible for all the tailings. So you've got a person, just like in resource inventory. You've got engineers of record on site who sign off on things. Then you've got independent technical review boards that review the operations and things like that. So that's the governance elements. So that's where the K2Fly part of the solution sits on top of the bottom-up approach from Decipher, if you like, collecting the data, even reporting to Church of England and things like that. But over time, so we're building use cases for different people that sit in that governance structure. What do I need to know?
Yeah.
What's important to me in my role at my level that's critical for me to know when and where, and red, green, amber lights and all that sort of stuff. So a dashboard approach to that, but obviously being able to look through into the data all the way down to the monitoring side of things. Because some of these facilities are so old, you've got 60 plus years of data for these independent technical review boards or engineers of record to sift through and get their head around. So there's a lot of data in there that they need to be able to access very, very quickly and readily.
Yeah, exactly right, Nick. And also, with the standard coming out, we're obviously going to see a pressure on technical resources that are reviewing these standards. That's required. So these individuals are going to need to know a lot about the site really, really quickly to make determinations and make decisions. So having a platform or an ability to get into that really quickly from either a governance angle or a monitoring angle, top-down, bottom-up kind of approach, is pretty critical. And I think that's where the two solutions coming together hits that sweet spot.
You mentioned like 60 years worth of data in some cases. That's just, it's hard to fathom to some extent. How do you process all of it?
Well, if it's digital, it's okay. But a lot of these, records are sometimes scanned copies. So we've been asked by some customers to OCR their data and run it through something like a Watson, IBM Watson program and pull that data out into a structured database. So that gets pretty exciting. But generally, from an instrumentation perspective, being vendor agnostic is really important for us.
Yeah.
Customers choose what they want in what region of the world. And generally that data is electronic by the time we get to it. So integrating that into the solution, and as Nick says, putting that into the right alarms and alerts and those sort of things is pretty important, so that the governance processes that sit over the top are running true and appropriate for that organisation. And I think, again, just think about, we're going to start hitting more of a problem of non-technical people starting to get access to technical data. And we've seen that in other areas of mining and oil and gas and those sorts of things. And I think that's just something we need to think about as an industry and us as a vendor in that industry. We're opening up data like INSAR defamation to people, and understanding why that's happening, how it works, those sorts of things, needs to be vetted and needs to be quite careful how that message gets out to Joe Public. Making the data available, that's great. That's perfect. And that's one of the principles sitting inside the standard. But I think also being careful how we present that data, that's something we need to consider going forward as well.
Yeah, I think, like any risk or materiality, ESG, materiality, sustainability risk, you're looking at materiality, right? So it's about removing the noise and focusing on the things that you need to focus on. And getting, as Anthony says, there's probably a shortage of geotechs worldwide now in order to support all these processes. So how do we make them as efficient as possible?
We have touched on this, but I think there is more of a conversation to be had here, and that is social license. I mean, operators now need to demonstrate their tailings management and monitoring. They need to be, or there is an increased call for transparency. How does Decipher and the K2 Fly collaboration fit into this?
My read is that over the last few years, the term social license has actually been downgraded, become less used. And it's sort of been replaced by ESG, or environmental, social, and governance. But some of the things we've seen happen in lately, and as I said, the issue in the Pilbara with the Juukan Caves, they're case studies in social license, right? Because even though it was legal to destroy that cave, there wasn't a social license to do that. So you had a license to do that, but not a social license to do that. And you couldn't get a bit, unfortunately, a better case study, in a tragic kind of way. In a social license environment, a proper one, you need to have something, loosely termed sort of meaningful stakeholder relationships. And that means that you're communicating properly with the communities that are involved, the stakeholders. And what was really interesting out of some of our earlier sort of understandings, our interviews with the customers, in certain parts of the world, stakeholder relations means I, as the miner, tell you what's going to happen. That's not what we would consider to be meaningful stakeholder relations. It has to be a two-way conversation. So everything we do as a company, in terms of all of our solutions, stakeholder relations is a part that runs within everything we do. So, whether that be heritage conversations or land access conversations, exploration conversations, or indeed tailings conversations, stakeholder relations is in there. So that was also something that was raised by the GTS in terms of that term meaningful thing. So obviously, having all your license and your obligations is a license to operate. A social license is when you've got the full buy-in of the communities that you're affecting.
Yeah, Nick, I fully support. I think that's exactly right. I think social license is an informal license negotiated between the company and stakeholders and various stakeholders around that operation. It's hard to win and easy to lose. And I think with the recent disasters, there's a couple of headwinds that need to be made. And again, tailings management is an area of interest to stakeholders and a source of potential loss, of trust due to these major disasters. There's some people who who no longer believe that the mining industry can manage tailings safely. Hence there's opposition to mining in general. So it's about how do we get over that and how do we manage our way forward. The thing that we can't get away from is there's increasing scrutiny and disclosure expectations from those companies off the back of this. So how do we put that forward in a position of trust? And as Nick says, if you've got two-way communication and you're using stakeholder kind of management at the bottom, you're going to push that all the way through your organisation. I think that's kind of the social license to operate kind of model going forward in this space.
Yeah, and you have to get away from silos because particularly the bigger the organisation, the more the size or the bigger the silos. So it's the company's social license. So it's not just a heritage issue or a geotechnical issue or a regional issue. You've got to operate, as a business that manages across all those silos to maintain, as Anthony says, it's hard won, very easy to lose. So to do it properly, you've got to get out of that silo mentality, and that's where technology can play a massive role in breaking down those silos.
Yeah, Nick, and just to come back to a point I made a little bit earlier as well, I'm not a geotech, but there's a lot of complex information that sits in a tailings facility and why it's designed and the probability of safety and factor of safety and all those sorts of things. But it's how to present that back to those stakeholders in a manner that's easy to understand, and also so that it enables and promotes trust, and that kind of interaction between key people in the organisation, those stakeholder communities, is critical.
Well, I guess I'm guessing it would also depend on what stakeholders or
Correct.
how you define those stakeholders too.
Yep.
Yeah. Now, well, then so obviously one of the big drivers of this whole change that we're seeing is finance. Right?
Yeah.
So talk about a stakeholder. So clearly the communities and people at risk are very really critical of stakeholders, but my studies have shown that sort of the biggest change agent here has been finance.
Yeah.
And obviously finance now needs to take a longer view of those investments, such that it's not like we can just invest in something, get out in 5 years' time, and we no longer have any sort of responsibility to that investment. That doesn't happen anymore. So they are taking a really long view, and they are driving this need for transparency, this need for governance, this need for proper, meaningful stakeholder relations in order to sign off on those financing packages.
Out of interest, I'm really interested in the finance side of this. When did you start seeing a bit of a change here?
I think it didn't come out of mining necessarily. What finance industry started to realise is there's quite a lot of studies out there that demonstrate that a company that's better run in an ESG sense is now providing better returns to their shareholders, amongst other benefits. There's revenue benefits, but there's capital benefits as well. So that's becoming the norm now.
Yeah.
So even the notion of an ethical investment fund is going to become somewhat redundant because you're not going to put your hand up and say, I run a non-ethical fund. It's going to be baked into your process.
Yeah.
Right. So it will become increasingly the norm. Just like sustainability needs to be baked into processes within all companies, but particularly mining companies, just like we saw with health and safety. Health and safety was a really key, important issue that the industry needed to address, really importantly, and it became a big thing, and people focused on it, and they really focused on it hard, and now it's baked into the industry. I think you're going to see the same happen in sustainability, and I think finance is driving that a lot.
Yeah, and again, from a tailings perspective, I've recently attended an Oz IMM course and on tailings facilities, and there's less about the NPV that relates to a TSF than what's going to happen to the communities post mining. So it's not just about that dollar or that amount anymore. It's thinking further ahead. And what really struck me when the GTR was released, they had a series of speakers, and one of the speakers, Angelica Andrade, who lost her sister in the disaster, there's a quote from her, says, "It's time for the mining sector to stop being all about profit and to act with humanity." And I thought that was incredibly powerful and resonated across industry quite a bit. It's about a balance between these things, as with anything. And certainly we're seeing, I think we're seeing the turn around the corner where we're certainly in the tailing space. It's more about how we manage these things going forward and get after them.
Nick, a huge part of finance when it comes to mining operations is insurance. It's a big area of concern for mining companies given its impact on the bottom line. we have seen reports of how insurance is changing in the tailing space. Can you give us a little bit of an insight into that and your role in the solution?
Sure. There's two key types of insurance that would be affected by this type of disaster. So there's your property damage, business interruption, and then there's your public liability insurances.
Yeah.
Okay. So obviously we've seen disasters happen in a certain part of the world, and that part of the world is actually also somewhat exposed to climate and also extreme weather events, etc., etc. You don't see those types of risks necessarily in the Pilbara of West Australia. However, the insurers all go back to a head office, which is probably in the US or Europe or somewhere like that. So they look at this on a global scale. They don't look at it in a regional sense. So what's happened is they essentially, they don't really want to be associated with the facilities in the first place. So what do you do when you want to get out of a market? You try to price yourself out of it. But obviously, so what we've seen is that in the last few years, now that this has become a focus, we're sort of seeing, generally premiums have gone up by 20% sort of per mine site for both 20%. Of those. 20%.
That's huge.
Yeah,
it's huge.
And if you start to multiply that out in some of these, mega miners with multiple mine sites, so, I mean, that can be anything sort of $500,000 to $1 million or even a couple of $100,000 across many mine sites is a big amount of money. All right. And, there's only so many insurers you can go to. You can't shop around too much, right? So that is obviously exposing these companies to a lot more money going out.
Yeah.
And then when you start to compare that to the sort of, the sort of price point that we're coming in at, which is not going to be cheap by any means, but obviously it's going to be thorough. It's going to be the return on that is going to be really, really valuable.
Nick, we were talking earlier about some areas of the world that you can't actually get insurance anymore around these facilities as well. So that's a big challenge. Yeah, that's a big challenge. So,
what areas are those out of interest?
Brazil, China, parts of Africa.
Yeah,
it's becoming really, really difficult to get insurance. So that regionality aspect is pretty important as well. For us, from a Decipher perspective, it's about exposing key data to insurers as well, so that they get the visibility into the organisation. So again, it just reiterates that delivery of information to other interested and affected parties as really, really important. And then if you put the governance layer over the top that K2Fly does, they can be assured that the data they're getting can inform what they're going to do around premiums, those sorts of things.
So we're definitely hearing anecdotal evidence that the insurers are asking to be able to look at the documentation associated with that facility.
Yeah.
So that is quite a arduous task unless you have systems like ours. And what impact would that have on your premium? But, if we could give them, for instance, a login to the systems that we're providing, which is limited to what they need to see, then there's a very good case to say that those premiums can come down because you are doing a good job of managing those facilities. Therefore, the risk is lower than, the next person or the next organisation. So that could, this solution could have a very dramatic impact on reducing insurance premiums as well as doing the right thing in terms of managing those facilities in a much more thorough way.
Yeah, Nick, there's also an efficiency play in there. I mean, think of a tier one organisation that has 100 or 200 dams impoundments globally. It's going to take someone a week on each site to assemble that info and put it into a format that can be consumed. So
important. So many of our clients benefit from our solutions in terms of internal and external audits. So by the sheer fact that they have our system means that they can just give the auditors a login and they can go and look wherever they like.
Correct.
But it's not question and answer coming to and from the operator all the time that they're having to respond to and spend people's time on, valuable people's time on. They can just give them, here's the system, go for it. So that's a big improvement.
People are obviously taking this up. Can you name some clients that have been sort of charging forward with this?
Well, we've got a case study on our website, so just head across to decipher.com.au and you can read that. Obviously, our customers take it from different angles. Some will go just into the monitoring space and solve a particular issue around that. Well, not issue, solve a particular requirement to drill and expose that data. Some organisations will look just at the disclosure process. So we're kind of seeing two ends of our product. Extreme kind of monitoring and then sort of high-level reporting disclosure database. So on the website, case study about Rio that that was looking to get some efficiencies in that area and get into it, is pretty critical. And Nick, you mentioned Rio from a governance perspective as well. Yeah, so that could be an area where we will get the system to work together.
Yeah, and we're due to release our first version at the end of this year. So we're actually now tonight we're giving our first detailed demonstration to a major global miner on in our first cut of the minimum viable product.
Yeah, wow.
So we're rapidly moving towards that, and as I said, we're working with Decipher and with SAP globally. So we working closely with the SAP Mining Advisory Committee, which is obviously made up of all the major miners in the world. So we've been going through a very thorough evaluation with Anthony and the Decipher team of these major customers and what their requirements are, and we're in the build stage now.
Anthony, we've been very Australia focused in this podcast, but I'd like to know, internationally, you've got quite a large presence too, right?
Yeah, well, again, some of the head offices are just down the road here, and operations are global. But certainly, if the response that we're getting back to our software and our tool is anything to go by, the South America, Canada, US, Southern Africa, over in the rest of the APAC region, a lot of interest from there. Parts of Europe as well. There's been significant interest from those areas too, and quite dispersed, through tier 1 and tier 2s. It all depends on what you're looking at. Are you looking at an efficiency play, or are you looking at providing information because you're wanting to achieve an outcome, whether it be insurance or disclosure or something like that? So the drivers are different, but I think it's a global issue and a global problem. You may have heard the South African accent. I was actually in South Africa in Klerksdorp, 1994 at the Mariesspruit disaster where one of the facilities failed, and I remember actually walking around on those mines and having a look at it, and I kind of that memory left me for 15, 20 years, and it's only when I revisited that I realized, geez, that was actually something significant back then as well. So I'm so glad that the industry has come back and had a really good, long, serious look at this, and we're seeing the stepwise change that is taking place in all regions, all locations.
Let's touch on the unavoidable issue of 2020, and that is COVID-19. It's rattled markets, as we know. It's been a challenge operationally for mining companies, oil and gas companies, any resource company, and their service providers too. What has this meant for Decipher and K2Fly?
Yeah, well, COVID-19 from a Decipher perspective, and remember we're part of the wider Wesfarmers Group, employing 230,000 odd people in Australia, and we've seen some really, really strong messaging coming out from Rob Scott and the senior management team, just about how to manage that from a on the ground perspective. From a Decipher kind of point of view, from a monitoring and software point of view, we can operate it all remotely. We can deliver projects remotely, so reasonably unexposed in that area. Sometimes we have to provide hardware, and through partners like GlassTerra, for example, we can deploy those remotely as well, which has been a really good learning. So an IoT device deployed remotely through the customer, train the customer up on how to install it and configure it, and then consume that data going forward. So we've managed to step around some of those issues. In fact, our business from next year going forward is going to go officeless. So we're not going to have we're not going to have an office, and we're going to run that business in that manner, which is quite interesting.
Seems like the way of the future, doesn't it?
Well, possibly.
Anything to add, Nick?
Yeah, well, I mean, from our perspective, similarly, we deliver remotely. So we used to fly people in for sort of at the beginning of a project and the end of a project for training purposes. We've realised that we can do it without it. It makes it a bit harder, but we can do it. What was really interesting from our experience particularly during the bottom of the trough, if you like, when everything was bleak. We, like everybody, we were sort of reviewing everything and all of our projects. We had a number of projects due to close, et cetera, and they were all reviewed by the customers, because they were reviewing everything too under the circumstances.
All expenditure,
and every one of them came through. And I think that's because of the fact that they were linked to governance.
Yeah.
So, they weren't sort of an arbitrary spend. They were, what was considered really, really valuable. A conversation I had yesterday, which is really impactful on this, is it was with an assurance person in a major mining company, and that person was talking about, because of COVID, you've got all these governance processes which rely on inspections.
Yeah.
Particularly tailings, but not limited to.
Yeah.
And there's less people wandering around. Right. So how do you ensure that these things are actually going on?
Yeah.
When you've got less people actually inspecting things, or a reduced capacity in that regard. So again, technology, and particularly technology like Decipher's and the monitoring side of things, plays a massive role in that. And then obviously that rolling up in order to make the executive and the board, that's the part we play, feel comfortable that they are doing a proper job. So that's a key factor that's going to play out more and more in the next few years, I think.
Yeah, definitely seeing COVID changing behaviour in this area and lots of other business areas.
Yeah. We're just about out of time, but I'm guessing the relationship and the collaboration between Decipher and K2Fly is only going to grow. What's next, and what's your outlook for the future?
Well, I mean, as I said, we're very focused on tailings at the moment, but the rehab, environmental side of things is something that we really want to get into. We kind of see this as a stepping stone, if you like. So we've come out of the mineral governance space, we've stepped into tailings, which has obviously got a lot of attention. Again, more recently, we've seen a lot of attention in and around heritage, and there was clearly governance failures there as well. So we just see that this will step right through all of those ESG fundamentals, if you like. And in that respect, we look to partner with Decipher, in any way we can throughout those. So once we've got that basis, starting with tailings, we'll move through together on these other things.
Yeah, I agree, Nick. That land management question is really important, and it's how you manage that and how you get forward. So, as Nick mentioned, the MVP presentation tonight is pretty important.
Yeah.
And then it's about building onwards and upwards from that. I think it's a really different take and a nice, neat take on how to package lots of complex data together and deliver it simply. And it's about recognising adjacencies that we can take it to.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you mentioned the rehab reclamation side, because that's pretty critical. As an enviro kind of background, certainly closure of mines and closure of facilities is really important to me personally. Spending time and attention on that is great. And it's about that management and transition of land from maybe a producing landscape to mined landscape to producing once again. And I think that comes from my agricultural heritage as well. It's all of those bits kind of wrapped into one. So it's about taking these two sides to a coin and working out how we can apply it in different areas. So I'm pretty excited by that.
Well, I think the other thing is that it's just going to get busier, given that, we've only had a handful of mines close here in Australia.
Yep.
You look at, the next 60 odd years, and there'll be a fair whack of work coming through, I'm sure.
Yeah, and Decipher is also part of the CRC Time project, and that's pretty critical in looking at trends and rehab reclamation over the next 10 years in Australia. So we'll start seeing a lot of change in that area too. And it's just about applying the same principles we've been discussing today to those areas. Technology and governance are really important.
I think that's all we have time for. Anthony, thank you so much for joining us from Decipher, and Nick from K2Fly.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.